Okay, thank you. While they're putting this slide up, I just want to make a comment. I'm surprised that they only listed 6 in innovation, because innovation science is what we're about. So everybody is innovative today. We just simply have a few more priorities perhaps, but I'm interested and I've been excited about what I'm hearing with the innovative science. Okay, just very briefly by background, I'll spend about 5 minutes describing where we are with a specific approach to start modifying soil so that we can bring the genetic potential of most new gene pools, at least of crops, to their maximum potential. Our difficulty is we have been spending most of our time trying to improve plants, especially genetics of resilience to disease, drought, etc. In the meantime, we're working with farmers of saying, well, here's the best management system, but we still have to be a little bit more innovative as we modify, especially some of the highly permeable soils that occupy somewhere in the neighborhood of 39% of the planet. And if you look at just the 2% slope of most of these sands and smaller, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 billion acres of soil that we can begin to transfer into agriculture that is sustainable. So I'll give you a 5-minute or less summary of that process and then show how we're using this to begin to ask the question, what is the root water uptake efficiency and how much carbon does it cost? I'd just like to give my co-authors, Brian Levine, a postdoc and a visiting scientist from China that's working with us, and you can see the industry groups that have been supporting this. This is an 11-year project that we started some time ago, but it was much longer ago. We came to the conclusion as we put in multiple soil moisture probes, understood the matric potential of the water that was being held in these soils, that there are many losses of roots. We've heard some of that during this session as well, that as we go deeper into the soil, we lose them, but it's at a lower a level of matric potential that you can see in these 100 centimeter deep roots. There's finer soil, more surface area, more clay, etc., smaller pores, etc. So the water is being held at much tighter at the lower depths in most of the soil profiles. So we looked at sand soils, and we've got 18 million acres of those in Michigan, so that's one of the areas we've been looking at for some time. People for 5,000 years have been trying to modify sands to hold water. It's very important, it's essential. We can develop a hydroponic system, optimum air, optimum water, optimum oxygen that plants these. But if we look at these a little bit, we can change, if we put something in to begin retaining more water, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20%, then we can move that field capacity of that sand, essentially double it. So our goals have been to put something in to hold these water contents in the root zone and begin to double the water holding capacity in the root zone. The deep is 40, 50 centimeters, and we'll talk more about that. We went to HYDRUS 2, developed this with Dr. Gruber. This was published just a couple years ago, and we begin to ask the question, if we're in a humid region where we have rainfall, we need to develop these little barriers. These are polyethylene, linear low-density polyethylene, that can be put in the soil deep enough so that there's no UV light, and the chemists, polymer chemists tell us these should last 200 to 400 years. What we're looking at, though, is something that's long-term but self-draining. So if we get too much water, that begins to drain over the edge. But if we get it too flat, it holds very little water for a very short period of time. So you can see from 21 days of flooding, after 11 days later, we were holding roughly 2.5 times more water than the flatter surface membranes. So again, very pictorially, this is what it looks like. We've been in 4 countries and 4 states so far. It seems to be working with a range of 16 different crop types, and the increase in yield ranges from 20 to 415%. Depends upon the crop type and location. What we're very interested in, what's happening in most irrigated sands, at least in the States, and I believe some of that is true here in Israel as well, that we're losing very large quantities of water, whether it's English or metric, that simply drain beneath the root zone. So these are the definitions that we find across the fields. This is just one that we took this past year, if we look at the installation of the subsurface water retention technology, we call it the acronym SWRT, and it's irrigated, we can retain enough water in that soil at somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 20% at a 15 centimeter depth. If we just have rain fed in that same sand, we're well below this red dash line where we're losing yields, perhaps total losses. If we move now down to 30 centimeters, we will see that we're holding a little more water in the irrigated above these water retention membranes. But if we are irrigating at 30 centimeters deep, on the surface, of course, at 30 centimeters deep, we're losing much more water into deep drainage. And of course, if it's rain fed, there's essentially no yield. And just one bar graph that shows with maize, we've increased the yield somewhere between 90 and as high as 140% in different years, but the average of 4 years gives us somewhere in the neighborhood of 21.8 metric tons, or that's 200 or 340 bushel per acre. So we have mini rhizotrons. We've been looking at these for the past 6-7 years, asking the question, how deep are these roots that are branching? These are secondary and tertiary, primarily roots of maize. And what's puzzling us a bit is that we're finding the roots live much longer than the average publication, including this author, of 24 to maybe 27 days. We're finding the same roots at 40 to 50 centimeters deep that arrive there at about the V4 stage of maize. And these roots are still there at the end of harvest. So they can last somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80 days if we have optimum water, oxygen, and nutrients. Okay, let's look now what happens with regard to the root length density in these soils. We're looking at somewhere between 0 and 140, and this is the water content over on the right side, the volumetric water content. Again, the green is with the membranes, the red is, of course, the controls, and we're looking at depths here of 30 centimeters. So we ask the question, what happens to the roots as we go through some of these drying sessions? And we've been working at all these. I don't have time to present those, but these are some of the larger drying sessions for just a couple of days, 3 to 4 days. We begin to see root death. But if we look at the green, which is the SWRT membrane water holding capacity of the root zone, we're having somewhere in the neighborhood of 73% less root growth with very large shoot growth in contrast to the controls. Okay, so what happens to each of those with regard to the water uptake efficiency, root water uptake? Well, first of all, it's a little drier. We're going to look at rain-fed, and then we're going to look at irrigation. Next slide. So what we will do is we'll check what the water content is here. It's somewhere between, we can't see that from here, somewhere between 6 and 8 and 12%. So we've got a 4% drop here on the controls. Here we have a less drop. We're somewhere between 14 and 12. But notice what's happening with the root water uptake efficiency. It's somewhere in the controls, which is losing quite a bit of water. And that water, of course, is at a much lower matric potential. It's a higher matric potential, I'm sorry, it's a smaller quantity of water. So the hydraulic conductivity is moving much more slowly of the bulk water to that root system. And even if we have the larger number of roots, we're still having a very, very low root water uptake capacity compared to where we have optimum water contents. And if you look at these numbers, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a 6-fold increase in water uptake efficiency between the two. Let's see what happens as we irrigate. Well, some of us, including I think in this country, have come to the conclusion if we would irrigate 5 or 6 times a day, we could save some of that deep leaching. But if we do, our problem with this is that we still are losing water into the deep drainage below the root zone, as well as we still have a very low root water uptake efficiency compared to what we have on these sands at the same depth of SWRT improved water holding capacity. So let's look again at what's happening with respect to that carbon that's being allocated from the plants down to the roots. We did not measure the total carbon here. We simply used the literature that's in the data that's in the literature of somewhere in the neighborhood of 34% of roots on a length basis as it's dried is carbon. So we use 34% to show the differences here between these two. And we'll look at them very closely. The red, again, is the control at 9 to 23 centimeters of length, root length. The reason we have the 9 to 23 centimeters is because our soil moisture probes are at 15. So we went a few above those and a few mini rhizotron photos below those so that we have a pretty close approximation of the exact water content where those roots are growing. Then if you look at deeper, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 23 to 36 centimeters deep. Again, we had soil moisture probes. All of these have 5 to 16 replications, so we're not going into the statistics, but there are certainly major differences. So when we look at these and combine them, let's look at what the water holding capacity of SWRT is. There is a little drop here because there's depth. Then there's regrowth, but then it's rather uniform across this entire spectrum for a period of the full crop. But if we combine then the shallow versus the deep, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 plus 800, so it's about 2 kilograms of carbon per meter cubed lost by these roots when they're going under stress. We're still losing some from the optimal water content, but it's 2 times the 400, so it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 grams of carbon loss per meter cubed in the soil. These are numbers that are within the literature. We're at the high end of what's in the literature, and I think as we look a little more closely and as we get back to measuring the exact carbon in the primary, secondary, tertiary roots, etc., we'll find much more exact numbers. Okay, so as we go through this and try to summarize it so that we can ask the questions, how well can hydropedologists, how well can soil biophysics, soil physics people work with plant geneticists? And I think the more closely we work together and we test the new genotypes with the different hydraulic properties of the soil that we're testing them in. For example, if we use some nice potting soil that has organic matter and sand and so forth of the greenhouse, that has a completely different hydropedology in the supply capacity of that water to the root system. So we can use small containers, we can use very large containers, but I think what we hear toward the end of this session, I think it's in Thursday, Bob Shark is doing some of this work, Spark is doing some of this work very well. And I'm looking forward to hearing his presentations, because the better we test whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary roots, whether it's nodal or other types of roots into different soils of different surface areas of the mineral, we're going to find the sands hold it much less, with much less matric potential. But if we have a mixture of sand and clay, then we find those fine structures of the clay surface and the small pores in that clay holding that water from moving into roots, even though we might have more roots or fewer roots. So we need to really understand what that hydrological property is, or those flux rates of diffusivity of water to the root surface that we think is going to be most active based on many of the hormonal changes and so forth we've heard so far in this session, in this symposium. Then number 2, I think, as we couple water use of root uptake of water and ask the question, what is the cost of that? That's going to help us a whole lot better to understand how the ratios of shoot to root of these maize crops that we were telling you we're producing 20-some metric tons per hectare, those shoot to root ratios were in the 0.46, 0.47, And by the time we saved all of the roots, we found that that shoot-to-root ratio jumped to somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.6, 5.8. So we're still, excuse me, keeping a lot of carbon in that shoot portion. And of course, that's what most of the agriculture is focused toward, to keep as much in that, at least the energy source or the food source above ground. Okay, number 3, if we design new optimizing technologies that match the genetic resilience, then I think we're moving in the right direction. I worked with plant geneticists now for 40-some years at Michigan State, and they often, I think most of them still, are sending their new genotypes to 5 to 7 locations and say, well, the average of these 5 to 7 locations prove that we've got a drought resilient or a nutrient a capacity for absorbing nutrients, but we're still missing this whole concept of, can we design specific soil types, not just regions? If you look at least across the United States, we have about 7 different soybean production regions. And we really need to look at the soil types that are part of that, that's going to maximize the genetic potential of these new genotypes. And then I guess the 4th comment that I think needs to be made here is we need these long-term modifications in the soil technology as well. It's more than just adding a few kilos, pounds of NPK, micronutrients, a little water, etc. We've got to develop systems that are not just additions on an annual basis for annual crops, but putting not only the rotations together, but also modifying that soil in a way that it holds more water and holds more nutrients, especially those who are of the highly permeable component of agriculture. Now, one of the attributes we found with the SWRT system is that it makes substantial contributions to both production. Here are 4 of them we've talked about. We haven't spent much time about the improvements of the environment. We can certainly keep a lot of the surface soil tied up in cover crops because there's more moisture there year-round, so we lose less phosphorus as the surface erosion. We're saving 37 plus pounds per acre. Sorry, didn't convert that to metric. We also are reducing greenhouse gas production. The question that usually arises, how are we modifying the soil microbiome? Jim Teege, Dr. Teege, the director of the soil ecology program for the past 40 years, or 35 or 40 years, has worked with us very closely. And we've seen a little bit more DNA increasing in the microbial populations. However, every single one of these microbes are aerobes. We don't have a single anaerobe, so we're not losing nitrous oxide, we're not losing much methane out of those soils that are producing very high products of carbon. It also reduces groundwater contamination. One point I don't have here that we're finding with our collaborators in China, excuse me, is that when we have a lot of salt in the soil and there's a shallow groundwater that's saline, we can stop that upward movement of salts with these membranes. And if we add enough water, we can dilute the salinity that's inside, inside the membranes. And Iraq has shown us that as well. The decisiemens of some of those saline soils, sand soils, started at 6.2 or 3. We're down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.3 to 3.5 after 2 years of irrigating with fresh water. So we see that there's a lot of potential out there. If we can continue to expand this process, we'll find that not only are we increasing potential of production of grains and biofuels, etc., but we're putting more plants in more soils across the climate, across the globe, to see if we can feed some of the majority of those 10 billion that are going to be on planet Earth here in the near future. So I'll stop with that and have a minute or two for one or two questions. So thank you very much for your attention.